Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Gilespie and the title of my project is Canopy Structure and Southwestern Willow Flycatcher, a LiDAR-derived habitat suitability model. So my objectives for this talk are to go through an introduction of the flycatcher, talk about my study area, the data sets I used, go over the canopy structure metrics that I calculated using the LiDAR data, go over the model fitting process, go through my results and accuracy assessment, and give you my conclusion. So, Southwestern Willow Flycatcher is a neotropical migrant songbird with a breeding range in the desert southwest. It is a riparian obligate, meaning that it only nests in riparian forests, that is along rivers. And its prey is aerial insects. So willow flycatchers will tend to take a prominent perch in the forest, like in this picture, where they can see pretty well and they have some room to fly, wait for an insect to fly by, and then pursue it through the air. So in the 20th century, there was a decline in flycatcher populations, basically due to dams and groundwater pumping, which changed the hydrology of the riparian forests and reduced the extent of riparian forests in desert areas. Also as a result, tamarisk and Russian olive, which are invasive tree species, were able to sort of take over in especially low elevation riparian forests. Luckily for the flycatcher, tamarisk and Russian olive can both be suitable habitat for them if there's other factors present. One of the biggest threats to flycatchers now is tamarisk leaf beetle, which was introduced as biocontrol and has been spreading across the flycatcher's range. So the Fish and Wildlife Service listed them as endangered in 1995, and in the recovery plan they basically call for conserving and restoring the breeding habitat of the flycatcher. So what does their breeding habitat look like? Well, according to this review article, some common themes are dense vegetation within 3 to 4 meters of the ground, which protects their nest from predation and parasitism and creates a cool, humid microclimate to keep their nest cool during the breeding season, which they breed relatively late into the summer when it's really hot in the desert. There's also small openings in that dense vegetation, so it's not uniformly dense. And there's slow-moving water or saturated soil somewhere in the territory, which is habitat for their prey, the flying insects. So if your feet are wet and you have to bushwhack to move around, and there are insects buzzing around your head, you may be in flycatcher habitat. There are some existing GIS models of flycatcher habitat, and they use relatively low resolution Landsat imagery. They're based on NDVI and floodplain geomorphology, but until now there's not been a GIS model that incorporates canopy structure. Even though, looking back, dense vegetation, small openings, these are canopy structure descriptions. So my research questions were, what are the canopy structure characteristics that are associated with flycatcher habitat? And can flycatcher occupancy be accurately predicted using canopy structure alone? So I was more interested in finding out what's the relationship between canopy structure and flycatchers rather than creating the most predictive possible model. So I was just using canopy structure. So moving on to study area. My study area was the Upper Gila River, which is a low elevation river northeast of here near Safford. There were 4 survey sites where I had flycatcher data, R3, R8, and so on. The R stands for restoration. These are places that are where habitat restoration is taking place ahead of the tamarisk leaf beetle arriving. So the survey data I had was collected in 2014. They're call playback surveys that are repeated 3 times during the season. And zooming into R3, the locations that were the dependent variable for my model were either nests, which is kind of higher quality data, that's the actual center of a flycatcher territory, or they were estimated territory centers. So I placed a point, digitized a point in the middle of clusters of places where flycatcher pairs had been seen. So moving on to talking about the LiDAR. First off, what is LiDAR? It stands for light detection and ranging. It is a remote sensing method that uses pulses of light to measure distance to the Earth. In this case, the LiDAR sensor was on an airplane that flew low over the riparian forest. And the result is this really dense elevation point data. So some terms I'll use are footprint, which is the size of the laser pulse where it meets the ground. And then a return is sort of synonymous with this three-dimensional point, and it's where that laser pulse was reflected off of something. And the first return is the highest point where that pulse was reflected. So the LiDAR data I had was captured in 2012, so almost 2 years before the flycatcher data. It was discrete return LiDAR. The footprint size was 0.5 meter. There were 2 shots per meter. And so this is a snapshot of the data. It's a 50 by 50 meter plot. And on the right there, you can see that's the canopy of a cottonwood tree. So that kind of gives you an idea of just how dense the data is. So let's move on to the canopy structure metrics. So first off, I had to pre-process the LiDAR data. I did all my LiDAR processing and almost the whole rest of the project in R scripting. So R is an open source programming language. And I used the package LiDAR. First step was to filter out outlier points. Then I converted elevations above sea level to height above the ground. Then my canopy metrics, so I calculated the statistics in 10-meter grid cells, which may seem like a pretty large cell size for LiDAR, but some of my metrics, I just needed a little bit more data, so that was kind of a compromise. So I calculated some basic statistics you can see here on the right, and then some more specific to the flycatcher metrics, such as cover above the mean nest height of 4 meters. I calculated that in a few different ways. And I also calculated leaf area density, which is a measure of sort of the foliage density in these different height bands, 2-meter height bands. And it's sort of a measure of how much light is stopped in that height band. Then I didn't want to just look at the 10-meter size, because that's probably a pretty good indication of the nest area of a flycatcher territory, but their whole territory is much bigger than that. So I also looked at 30-meter and 50-meter neighborhoods using focal statistics, and I calculated the mean, standard deviation, minimum, and maximum of all the metrics on the previous page. Once I had all those variables, I extracted the values from the rasters to the flycatcher points, and also to randomly generated points within the survey sites. So moving on to fitting the model. So at this point, I had over 200 variables, 200 independent variables. So there was a real risk of overfitting, of just throwing way too many variables at a small sample size and fitting the model to the noise in the data instead of the signal. So one way that I pared down my list of variables was by running univariate tests on each variable. So a logistic regression, a goodness of fit test, and a Mann-Whitney U-test. And then if the variables passed, if they were significant, they got fed into the multivariate model. So in the multivariate step, it was a backward stepwise logistic regression, predicting breeding location using the canopy structure variables. And my process was to run the regression, run some post hoc tests, and then based on the results of those, reject some variables, and then do it all again. So the criteria that I used to reject variables were the variance inflation factor, which sort of tells you if there are multiple variables telling the same story. And then I had to decide which of those variables to throw out. So if they had a non-significant coefficient, they had a poor contribution to the model AIC, which is a statistic that measures model quality. And I didn't have to do this very often, but sometimes I had to decide which one has the better interpreted value. So moving on to results. In the univariate step, 102 of those metrics passed, these criteria on the left. So a little bit less than half. And I don't want to say too much about these variables, but these are the top in terms of the AIC. And there's a lot of cover in here, and then the two that are highlighted are in my multivariate model. So this is the results of the multivariate, and there's the details on the left, but I'll just interpret them for you in English over here. So this first one is basically saying there's dense vegetation at that mean nest height within the 30-meter neighborhood. And the second one's saying, yeah, it's dense, but it's not uniformly dense. So it's a higher standard deviation within that 3 to 5 meter height band. And then the third one is saying there are some tall trees nearby, tall trees with dense foliage. So let's look what that looks like in the LiDAR point clouds. So in this figure, the light green points are within that height band, 3 to 5 meters. So this is the high density. This is high standard deviation. So you can see it's kind of dense on the left and not so dense on the right, bigger, more variation. And then this is a high median. So there are a bunch of returns up high. It's a high canopy, so the median height is pretty high. And this is almost certainly a cottonwood tree. So this is what it looks like on the site. You can see that the model is predicting these high probability cells. A lot of them are right on the flycatcher territory. So it, just passing the visual test, and it's also rejecting some of the sort of the vegetation that you can see in the satellite image that doesn't have flycatchers in it. But then it's also predicting some high probability cells way up here on the bottom of this map that are up on the terrace above the river, and I can tell you those are too dry to support flycatchers. So the accuracy assessment at 0.2 probability, 72% accurate, 76.5 efficiency. Efficiency is sort of a measure of how much area do you need to cover to encompass those points. Moving on to the conclusion. So revisiting those research questions, what are the canopy structure characteristics associated with flycatcher habitat? Well, dense vegetation, but not uniformly dense around the usual nest height, which is pretty similar to what that review article that I mentioned earlier said. And then there are some tall trees nearby. And I think that these are not really a structural requirement for the bird. Instead, they're acting as a proxy for proximity to water or saturated soil, because those cottonwoods and willows need a lot of moisture. And so in some areas that's working really well, and then up on the terraces above the river, those cottonwoods, there are cottonwoods up there, and they established during really big floods, or some of them are probably predate the sort of changes in the river in the 20th century. So can flycatcher occupancy be accurately predicted using canopy structure alone? Yes, but presence of water is a major missing component. So yeah, it's predicting those dry sites as suitable, and they're not. So in conclusion, this mostly confirms prevailing notions about flycatcher habitat, but it really highlights the importance of the canopy at that nest height. And the upshot for habitat restoration is that you should provide a dense but varied mid-canopy layer. So thanks to Matt Johnson, Bruce Orr, James Hatton, everybody at GIST, flycatcher field technicians who got their boots wet collecting this data, and my fiance Molly Sheehy for supporting me through all this. So, any questions?